She collected bleached bones across the prairie, long before anyone called her the bone collector. Her workshop always smelled of lye, hot glue, and the quiet promise of meticulous rebirth. Elias carried a ribcage of jagged grief that no one in the county could ever fully comprehend. He rode into her yard under a bruised autumn sky with a sorrow too heavy for words. Sarah's hands paused on a coyote skull as she watched the broken cowboy dismount in silence. He didn't introduce himself. He simply stared at her door like a man long past praying. She wiped her palms on her leather apron and stepped out into the cool, sage-scented air. His eyes were the color of storm-washed denim, and they held a depthless, cavernous ache. He finally spoke, his voice cracking like dry earth after too many years without rain. He needed her to articulate the skeleton of his late wife's beloved Mustang, a mare named Copper. The horse had been gone for 2 seasons, but Elias couldn't let her memory scatter to dust. Sarah understood memorials built from bone better than any preacher's sermon or granite headstone. She agreed without haggling over his offered payment because she recognized a man needing structural integrity. That first day, she led Elias into the workshop where articulated foxes and eagles lined the walls. He flinched slightly when he saw the hanging ribcage of a long-dead elk suspended near the window. She explained that every bone told a story of survival, landscape, and the creature's final breath. He handed her the carefully boxed bones of Copper, wrapped in an old flour sack cloth smelling of hay. Sarah opened the box and saw not just remains, but a map of love woven into calcium. The mare's pelvis still carried a tiny stress fracture from a river crossing during a flash flood. She traced the healed fissure gently, feeling the history thrum beneath her calloused fingertips. Elias watched her hands move with the same reverence his own hands once reserved for prayer. Over the following weeks, she began the slow process of degreasing and bleaching every bone. He started showing up without excuse, mending fence posts nearby or just sitting on her porch. Sarah handed him fine grit sandpaper and taught him how to smooth the marrow-dusted surfaces. Their fingers brushed over a clean cannon bone, and neither pulled away from the accidental touch. The workshop filled with an unspoken rhythm of shared labor and the ticking of an old clock. She told him how her father had been a naturalist who taught her articulation before she turned 10. He shared fragments about Rose, his wife, who could gentle any wild thing with just a whisper. The sound of her name didn't splinter him as badly when he said it beside Sarah's sorting table. Sarah noticed that his shoulders began to lower, no longer braced for an imminent invisible blow. Each evening she washed the lye from her skin and wondered how a man survived such weight. He started bringing her coffee in a dented thermos, the cream already stirred in just right. One morning a magpie landed on the windowsill, and Elias smiled for the first time in years. She recorded the small victory silently, cataloging it like a rare specimen inside her own heart. The mare's vertebrae required delicate wiring, each bone a pearl on a string of remembered gallops. She let Elias hold the flexible spine while she threaded the surgical steel wire through the canal. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the gravity of touching something Rose once loved. Sarah placed her steady palm over his knuckles and whispered that trembling was allowed here. The horse's skull stared at them with empty sockets, yet somehow it held an ocean of forgiveness. He finally wept, deep racking sobs that shook the beams of the workshop until dawn. She didn't shush him or hand him a tissue. She simply stood guard over his storm. Once the tempest passed, he looked at her with raw, unshielded eyes and asked if he could stay. She nodded, because her workshop had always been a sanctuary where broken things found their shape. They spent that night sitting back to back against the articulated elk, breathing in silent solidarity. The next day, she showed him how to mix the paste that would fill tiny missing bone fragments. His calloused rancher's fingers proved surprisingly adept at the intricate work of reconstruction. She laughed when he accidentally glued a tooth to his thumb, a sound that surprised them both. The laugh sparked something long dormant, like a candle flame catching in a windless prairie cabin. Elias realized he hadn't imagined a future for himself since the day Rose fell from the hayloft. Now, watching Sarah etch identification numbers onto a phalange, he pictured mornings with coffee and her. The Mari's skeleton began to take shape on the custom armature he welded in her forge. He shaped the steel struts with the same care he once used to craft Rose's wedding band. Sarah stood back and saw not just a horse, but a testament to endurance and quiet devotion. She told him that copper from the Mari's name meant conductivity, and energy still flowed between them. He traced the articulated withers and felt a current of gratitude so strong it hummed. Spring crept onto the prairie, melting the snow and sending fresh shoots through the frosted ground. The workshop smelled now of bone wax, ozone from the welder, and the undeniable scent of renewal. One evening, a photographer from a museum arrived, offering a substantial sum for the finished skeleton. Elias looked at Sarah, and without speaking, they both refused the offer in perfect unison. The Mari was never for sale. She was a bridge built from lost to something luminous and new. After the photographer left, he cupped Sarah's face with his work-roughened hands and just breathed her in. He said her name like it was the first prayer he dared to utter in 3 years. She didn't flinch or retreat behind her walls of bone dust and intellectual distance. Instead, she kissed him softly, tasting salt and the faint bitterness of old coffee and hope. The articulated Mustang stood sentinel in the corner, a silent witness to the fragile collision. That night, they didn't retreat to separate corners. They held each other under a patchwork quilt. Our bedroom smelled of sage and old books, and his presence finally felt like homecoming, not intrusion. He woke before dawn and watched the sunrise gild the bones of the creatures she'd saved. Sarah stirred beside him and realized her own ribcage no longer protected a hollow, echoing chamber. She felt structurally sound for the first time since her father died among his specimen jars. They walked to the workshop hand in hand, the prairie larks singing a reckless, joyful anthem. The final step was mounting Copper's skeleton on a reclaimed barnwood base Elias had sanded smooth. He carved Rose's initials and a small heart into the wood before Sarah waxed it for eternity. Together they lifted the completed horse onto the display, a graceful leap frozen in timeless light. The Mari's bones seemed to run, mane of memory catching an invisible wind that stirred the curtains. Elias placed his palm over the metal heart strut he'd hidden inside the ribcage during assembly. He told Sarah that Rose would have adored her, this woman who rebuilt what love had dismantled. Sarah felt a sob rise in her throat, but she smiled instead, steady as bleached prairie bone. The townfolk came to see the articulated wonder, and they finally saw Sarah differently too. They called her the bone collector still, but now with reverence instead of whispered, fearful superstition. Elias stood beside her at the small reception, his hand never leaving the small of her back. A child asked if the horse could still dream, and Sarah answered that dreams reside in memory's marrow. That answer coiled around Elias's heart and squeezed gently, a reminder that he could dream again. He took her riding through the north pasture on a living horse, the wind scrubbing them clean. They picnicked near the creek where Rose used to sketch birds, and he told happy stories instead of elegies. Sarah showed him how to spot the tiny rodent skulls hidden in the tangle of juniper roots. She taught him that every creature left a legacy in calcium, and none of it was insignificant. He realized that his own skeleton had been waiting, not for death, but for her hands to map it. They retrieved a fallen barn owl and articulated its wing together, a project of pure shared joy. The owl wing hung above their bed, a silent symbol of flight after a long, grounded imprisonment. Months later, he asked her to marry him inside the workshop, surrounded by her resurrected animals. He'd polished a ring made from a thin slice of Copper's cannon bone, set with a Montana sapphire. She cried, and her tears splashed onto the articulated fox, glinting like tiny diamond chips. She said yes, while the afternoon sun streamed through jars of alizarin and faint suspended bone dust. Their wedding took place on the prairie, with the articulated Mustang draped in wildflowers as their altar. The minister spoke about resurrection not from scripture, but from the proof of wired phalanges and healed hearts. Sarah's wedding dress had pockets, and she carried a tiny bleached wren skull for good luck. Elias's vows promised to be the armature she could lean on when her own frame grew weary. The ranchers who once pitied him now saw a man rebuilt, his grin as wide as the High Line. They danced under a string of lights while the old cowboy band played a waltz about second chances. A workshop still smelled of lie and rebirth, but now it also held the scent of his aftershave. Elias learned to articulate small birds by himself, surprising her on their first anniversary with a sparrow. She placed the sparrow on the windowsill and told him he was her greatest restoration project. He laughed, deep and full, a sound that no longer contained the echo of a collapsed spirit. When a winter storm trapped them inside for 3 days, they collaborated on a challenging badger skeleton. Working in the dim lantern light, their hands moved together like a single perfectly calibrated instrument. She caught him tracing her vertebrae one morning as she stretched, murmuring scientific names with wonder. He called her his living articulation, the woman who proved that love had a tangible structure. Their story spread quietly, a prairie legend about the bone collector and the cowboy she rewired. Young women with no taste for convention began showing up at her door asking for apprenticeship. She taught them not just bones, but how to listen for the hidden fractures in grieving neighbors. Elias became the unofficial handyman, welding armatures and telling their story to anyone who asked. He never shied away from Rose's name. He simply folded her into the architecture of their life. The articulated Mustang remained their centerpiece, a reminder that beauty could be salvaged from the scattered. Sarah became known as the heart articulator, though she insisted she had only ever polished what existed. On a quiet September evening, they sat on the porch watching a V of geese migrate southward. Elias noticed a new gray hair at her temple and thought it looked like silver wire, precious and strong. She leaned into his shoulder and listened to the steady rhythm of his perfectly functioning heart. The smell of lye drifted from the workshop, mixing with the sweetgrass and the coming twilight. He told her that grief was no longer a jagged ribcage, but a smooth, polished keepsake he could hold. She replied that love was the solvent that dissolved the toughest stains without damaging the original material. They went inside and added a new specimen to the collection, a dragonfly they'd found together that morning. The tiny articulated wings shimmered under the display light, a miniature testament to their shared, healed existence. She looked at him across the room, her eyes reflecting the delicate bones she dedicated her life to preserving. He saw his whole world in that gaze, wired together with patience, understanding, and endless forgiving strength. The prairie wind hummed around the eaves, and the workshop settled into its nightly symphony of quiet cracks. They climbed the stairs to their bedroom, where the owl wing promised flight and the blanket held warmth. Before sleep, he whispered a thank you into her hair, a simple prayer that required no bones to articulate. She smiled against his chest and knew his structural integrity was finally beautifully complete in her hands. Please make sure you subscribe to Weston Tales, official right now, and please leave your heartfelt thoughts in the comments below.